I've really been looking forward to today, as folks on this on this webinar know. We've been doing these all month, and frankly, it's been heavy on natural products and heavy on tactics and navigating the difficult economic conditions, or I should say, dynamic economic conditions out there. This poll result speaks for itself. People are feeling a little bit. I think we're getting accustomed to this kind of new reality, and having spent a lot of this month in these webinars, but also just even today talking to senior executives at Whole Foods, we're all. It's fascinating to see the changes we're making as we adapt in terms of increased e-commerce, getting to know our homes better, and health and safety, wellness practices that maybe we weren't paying as much close attention to. I want to remind everybody here before we go to Sonal that this is part of a series that is also tied in with the Hirshberg Entrepreneurship Institute next Thursday and Friday, our first online ever. We've been running the institutes for 20 years. And the Institute is all about, and everything HEI is all about, helping you and your enterprise to be more successful. If you followed my wife's book, Meg Hirshberg's book, she of course used to write for Inc. She wrote a wonderful entrepreneurship saga called For Better or For Work, a survival guide for entrepreneurs and their families. And our theme is certainly, we understand perfectly well that entrepreneurship, be it in the nonprofit context or the for-profit, it's never a siloed exercise. Family gets very messy. The lines between family and work and business and mission and politics and society are all always blurred, which is a perfect setup for our speaker today, because she's been a blur. She's been living in multiple worlds. I will say there's still room to join the Hirshberg Entrepreneurship Institute. We'll show you a quick program at the end. It's again next Thursday and Friday, but if you're trying to raise money, if you're thinking about raising money, if you want some tips and tricks to navigating the marketplace, better positioning your brand or your cause, I think you'll want to listen in. This is all case-based. It's no lecturing. It's no academic pontification. It's all grounded in the realities of some absolutely fantastic cases that have been presented to us. And then the following week, we will recommence with May, because this has been so such a successful and popular program. We will recommence with a series in May of other entrepreneurs also, and investors and others covering lots of different disciplines. So now on to Sonal, who I got to know really thanks to my daughter Danielle, who's her own social entrepreneur. Danielle was active on the Pete for America campaign. I was a proud supporter and donor, and Danielle said, "Dad, you've just got to meet this incredible woman, Sonal." Of course, Sonal and I, in fact, knew each other from the Obama White House going back, but we got reacquainted this last little cycle here. Sonal, as I mentioned, has worn lots of hats, and as she explains her story, I'm sure we will hear of them. She's certainly been active in government. At the Obama White House, she was the director of the Office of Social Innovation and Civic Participation, and a very close aide of the president's. And again, she's been active in politics. She was the policy director for the Pete for America campaign. But she's been, she's been an economist, a lobbyist. She's worked in academia, as she does now. She's the founding executive director of the Beek Center for Social Impact and Innovation at Georgetown. And she's also been an entrepreneur, active in quite a range of social enterprise, particularly in the bottom of the pyramid sphere, but also as an investor and starter with members of her family. So we have a real entrepreneur with us today who brings a lot of different experience. And as I say, it's actually exciting for me to not have somebody who's going to talk to us about selling organic widgets, although maybe you've got a surprise for us, Sonal. So welcome, and the floor is yours.
Well, Gary, thank you to Julie and Carlene also for helping put this together. I know there's always a lot of work that goes into it, and so Julie and Carlene, I know, put in a lot of the effort behind it, so a huge thanks to them, and thank you to you both for what you're doing with the Hirshberg Institute, but sort of just the championing that you have of the marketplace, especially around food and healthy foods, and just really sort of changing the shape of how we think about that. So thank you. I want to talk to all of you a little bit about sort of my journey, and hopefully let you know that sort of entrepreneurship happens at many levels. There's the starting of the business, which is an entrepreneurship, and all the work that goes through that. The nonprofit space where you are, where I can talk to you a little bit about my own experience and being an entrepreneur there. And then on the investor side, just to talk to you about what it takes, what we've learned from the investing side and what I learned when I became an investor. And then finally, entrepreneurship in large institutions, which can probably be the place where you want to bang your head the most. But if you can change some of them, the scale is much bigger, and the opportunity for scale is dramatic. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my personal entrepreneurship story, a little bit about the investment side, and sort of the little bit on the institutional entrepreneurship side. On a personal level, started a couple of nonprofits, one with my siblings in 2001, actually right after 9/11. It was sort of a Peace Corps for Indians. And the idea behind it had been to really find ways for second, third, fourth generations, South Asians, to find a way back to understanding their culture through service. And that had been, the Peace Corps exists, but they don't have a program in India. There were very hard ways to get to India. People were struggling to find individual ways to do that. And so that required us, understanding what was going on in India, which is not that different from what you would do as a business, but who was the marketplace, who are the people we were trying to attract to come, and then how do we make it a program that is palatable for people to go to? And while India seems really popular right now and an easy place to get to, and there are a lot of flights, I want to just tell you, in 2001, that was not the thing that people were thinking about. Most of the people in the community that I grew up in thought leaving India was the best thing they did, not going back to India or not going to India. So that has dramatically changed in the last 20 years, but certainly in the first 5 years, the number one challenge that we faced when we were running that program is parents telling their adult children that they should never go back to India.
Wow.
And they shouldn't go do service. They're wasting their time. They're wasting their time in a country that is never going to change. There was just a series of hosting problems. We had lots of people who applied to come. Once we accepted them, the single biggest barrier that we faced were parents. And the number one thing that we had to do we solved for lots of problems, right? We solved for getting there. We solved for the legal liabilities. We solved for the, taking care of the health pieces. The single barrier that we struggled with pretty much every year for the 15 years that we were around was both changing a culture within India that service was important and service was okay, and two, changing the culture of people in the West of Indian descent or South Asian descent that service was okay, and that their kids were going to be fine if they did a year of service. Part of the reason we changed the program to be a 1-year service program versus a 2-year one, which is what the Peace Corps is that we knew that the audience that we were working with would never go for 2 years. Wow. And so we sort of modified the program knowing that. We had spent about 2 years before we started the program understanding the landscape of service, both in India and globally. And that is looking at everything from the Jewish World Service to the Jesuit services to Peace Corps to every service program that probably has existed. We have probably talked to at some point in time and spent the time designing the program based on that. My brother moved to India and met with over 400 organizations to figure out how we find the first 10 partners. So we understood, because we also understood that we had to find the most palatable, least difficult players to work with in order to get this program started, and to send people overseas is no joke, especially if someone gets sick or if something happens, and there's a series of things we can work through. So And a couple of things that we learned on the India side, when my brother first went there, and even when I used to show up there, and when we used to tell them why we were coming, the folks at the airport would tell us we were wasting our time. They're like, this country is never going to change. Nobody cares about service. And this is the country of Gandhi, right? Like we sort of talk about Gandhi as if he's like huge, but at the same time, the single greatest thing that we heard was don't waste your time. And our challenge was changing perception. Our challenge was changing and convincing organizations that we could be a good partner to them, that there weren't just a bunch of people coming in from overseas and, you know, going to tell them how to do their job better. And three, convincing parents that their kids were going to be fine. So when we first started, what we had to work through was just sort of all of those negative perceptions. And that lasted, I would say, 5 years. You know, it was a 5-year process of convincing people that it was okay to keep coming there. And by year 6, 7, 8, more people wanted to partner with us, and service in the young Indians started to become a really cool idea. And so we started opening up the program for people domestically to participate or to learn or to be a part of. And we launched a bunch of series of side programs. You know, we created an ultimate Frisbee program and we created a sports program. But there were things more to attract people as to why service mattered and why you could do something with your time, not just your money. And that time made a huge difference. A lot of our projects that sort of came out of that became enterprises in themselves. So one was a water project that we launched in a series of 5 villages that eventually Audi and BMW made huge investments in to provide clean water to low-income communities. And it was a business. It was a paid water business. And what we learned in that project was when you started to look at the number of pouches, plastic pouches, poor communities were buying, and you added all that up and instead offered a osmosis-driven filtered product, people could pay the same amount of money, less money for a more quality product with more water. And that became a fairly large project that started to serve over 2 million residents in Delhi and another million in Bangalore. But that sort of became one business. Another that became its own business was we created a cooperative that came out of that sort of helped rural communities in parts of Gujarat sort of take their product and be able to sell them in the larger market. So they built the quality control system, they built the designs, they built the skill sets that the people needed in order to produce a product to do that. So it was a cooperative. It still exists and is doing actually quite well in India. But one of the things that we learned on that, and I just want to use this as an example of one part of being an entrepreneur is knowing, at least in the social side, is knowing if your time is up or not up. And what we learned in India after 15 years is that we had sort of seeded an ecosystem of service, lots of social enterprises. We had, I think, about 10 social enterprises that came out of the program we created. We had all of our partners, which by that time was over 400 partners, had sort of created their own service programs and figured out how to manage volunteers that were coming and how to do it well. And India had opened up itself, so people were going to India on their own and were trying to figure it out. So our decision at that point was to decide whether we close the fellowship. And 15 years later, we decided after a 3-year process that the best decision we could make is take the extra money we have and hand it over to our partners who were already doing really good work and sort of let them do the job that they know how to do and end the fellowship as it existed. And that was sort of the biggest decision we made. And the challenge wasn't us. I mean, I think actually as founders, we were sort of there and we had seen sort of the market trend and we'd seen what was happening. It was the people that had been fellows through the process who were sort of pissed off at us for almost 2 years that we wanted to shut it down. And what we learned in that is that their identity was linked to the institution. And so if the fellowship ended, how would people know that that was a valuable fellowship? Because it sort of became a pride thing in the community after 10 years that if you had gone to Indicor, you had done something, and people, universities were asking and professors were asking and community members were asking. So I think it's sort of, I don't think we were prepared for that piece. And that was something that we learned a lot about, which is really thinking about the effect on the people who came through the program and what it meant to them, not just because they were fellows, but how their identity was sort of tied into that process. And I think that's not different from when you start a business and you shut a business, your identity becomes very much a part of that business itself. And so that's something that was a good learning for us. But so we closed that program after 15 years, but it was sort of it was a long process, but it was the right thing to do. And frankly, we were able to give, over $50,000 per organization for them to be able to build out their own programming, and people we're still in touch with, which has been fantastic. So, that's sort of one experience of being a social entrepreneur. And, there's another one, which is I'm currently at, which is at the university, but it's a similar question that I ask now, which is how long do you exist in your program? And is success that you don't need to exist, or is success, at least from a social perspective, is success that you sort of grow bigger? And that's sort of a balance that I go through on a fairly regular basis.
So let me just interject, because I think I'm getting it. I want to play it back the way I'm hearing it. You're saying keep your eye on the cause, which is making lasting change in the communities, as opposed to building an institution that has its own overheads, et cetera.
Correct.
Mm.
Yeah, and the cause for us was to create an ecosystem of service in India, and to create an ecosystem of service of people wanting to go do service there and making it easier. And when we first started, we were probably one of only 2 games in town. By the time we left, there were, I'd say, at least hundreds of opportunities that people could go on their own. And many of them came out of the organizations we had worked with, and many new ones had gotten started that we seeded. So Teach for India, a bunch of these programs we sort of seeded along the way, and just gave them the initial capital to get started. But largely because what the impact we wanted to have was service. The impact wasn't how large did our organization become. So that was, Gary, does that answer that question? Yeah.
Just wanted to clarify. I mean, it's very interesting. You set out, the building of an institution was the means to the end, but not the end. And so often it becomes the end.
Correct. But it forced us to have that conversation amongst the 3 of us. My siblings were my co-founders. And so it sort of forced us to have that conversation amongst ourselves too, because our identities were also very much wrapped into that.
Mm.
But it was still today, I mean, we talk about it, but it was still, probably one of the best decisions we made.
Wow. Cool.
The second sort of piece of entrepreneurship I want to talk about is just from the investment side. So I have 2 experiences where I was an investor and not necessarily an entrepreneur. When I went to Goldman Sachs in 2004, Hank Paulson, who was then the chairman of Goldman Sachs and the president, wanted to really invest in clean energy and really think about how a company like Goldman could do more in the environment. And that required, I would say for me, a 6-month process, say a 7-month process with another partner at Goldman to really understand what is it that Goldman actually does. And we sort of think of it as an investment firm, but it's like thousands of businesses within one business. And what we learned were like 4 things that Goldman sort of broke down into. 1, it itself was a property manager. It had buildings, it owned buildings. There were things it could do on the environment based on just how it operated. 2, it was a research organization. So Goldman Sachs put out reports on which companies to invest in and how to invest in them, and what to look for in these investments. 3, it was a banking institution. So it was providing capital to organizations, mergers and acquisitions, capital, private equity, whatever. And then the last, it was an asset manager. And that was investing in large institutions to do that. So what we did is we broke that down, we broke that down into what could we do in each of those areas. How do you manage your buildings better and make them more green? And will not surprise you, in 2004 there were not that many places that you could go to find certified wood. I think there were 2 organizations that provided that service at the time. And our biggest challenge when we were when they were building that new building was that there just wasn't enough supply in the marketplace. And so what Goldman did is seeded a lot of nonprofit organizations to start creating certification methods. So more institutions could buy certified wood, certified products, you know, that were sort of more organic, more green. But that was in 2004, and that was probably one of the bigger decisions in doing that. The second area that we did a lot of work on is starting, and this was not, you know, we didn't sort of get this right at the time, but is training researchers to incorporate environmental, social governance criteria into their research products. And while it wasn't used at the time to make those decisions, it sort of became a long-term trend that over 10, 15 years, they started to look at that data more closely and which companies were sort of managing themselves better if they could manage through the environment. And that sort of became a really big part of the, you know, sort of the research department, but it also took entrepreneurial people within those departments who wanted to sort of buck the trend of their counterparts. And that was to me, one of the bigger learnings at Goldman, is finding those people within the institutions that wanted to do it, not just the usual suspects, because if you went to just the usual suspects, we weren't going to win, but we needed to find those people that were sort of willing to take some risk. And that was sort of one of the, and you know, sort of the thing that everybody sort of talks about with Tierra del Fuego, which was a property that Goldman Sachs had purchased in Chile, off the coast of Chile, Tierra del Fuego. It's sort of because we had sort of put attention to it, the bankers sort of looked at that property and saying, you know, it's pristine property. What could we do differently with that property? And what Goldman Sachs did and what the chairman did at the time was turn it over to a nonprofit, create a fund to perpetually fund that nonprofit to take care of that property. But that one example sort of seeded 15 to 20 different examples within Goldman, where people started to think about how they could, in their little institutional ways or in their own small ways, could help you know, use finance and use what they knew differently. But Tierra del Fuego is a big example of investing in that, which was about initially $150,000 investment that became a $5 million investment over time, that continues today, and that nonprofit continues to maintain the property there. So it was never developed; it just remained as pristine property, and that was one of the things that we sort of had done. But that led to one of our colleagues working with the Gates Foundation when they were sort of setting up the vaccine fund, of how we could set up a new finance model to advance purchase vaccines so we could build vaccines for poor countries. So there was a series of these things that started because of one or two examples that we sort of highlighted and made big. The third area that we were able to convince chairman at the time to do is to create a, at the time, which seems small, may seem big now, but it was small for Goldman, $500 million fund to invest in green technologies. And Gary, you'll appreciate this. This was the initial investment in Jigger's company, SunEdison. This was a large set of investments in wind at the time. This is 2004, 2005, 2006. Horizon Wind was a big purchase in Texas for Goldman. And then we also invested in sort of the trading markets. So the European Climate Exchange as well as the Chicago Climate Exchange. Those two ended up being real failures, largely not because the model was wrong, but because the governments didn't hold their promise of sort of limiting the carbon credits. And because the market sort of expanded, you can't trade when you keep adding more credits, it doesn't matter, like the value of it went away. And those two were sort of fairly dud investments, but it was important to sort of signal to the market that Goldman Sachs was sort of looking at making those types of investments, and they were fairly big players in that space. The Horizon Wind investment was probably singly the largest investment we made, and that was probably one of the biggest and best investments we made. I want to say we sort of bought that for $100 million and sold it for over $5 billion at the time. But wind was not that big at the time. And this was sort of, if you were sort of paying attention, who was sort of the governor at the time was George Bush. He was decoupling generation from distribution. And so we invested in the generation portion, and it was just a good time to make those investments. But Horizon Wind became a huge part. And because of Horizon, we also invested in Germany, all the production of wind turbines and all of those different pieces. So that became a bigger investment. So that fund went from 500 million to 3 billion over a 5-year period.
Wow.
But again, there were entrepreneurial people within Goldman who wanted to take those risks. And let me be clear, in 2004, that was a risk. And in 2005, that was a risk. No one was thinking about solar. No one was thinking about wind. No one, it was sort of like, we didn't even know if the tax credits from the government were going to last more than 2 years, especially in solar, which made the economics of that investment actually work. So that required sort of investment, but just a point to say there that, like, even in large institutions, you have to sort of take small things and make them big for more people to feel like they can be a part of that conversation.
Well, let me pause you there, because you've got 100+ people on the line who, most of whom are out trying to persuade somebody of some social or environmental mission underpinning their business. I mean, there you were in the belly of the beast, right? Wall Street, talking about this technology that you were tilting at windmills, right? I mean, it was just this. Are there key lessons? I mean, you said get it to scale. You had to talk big for those folks to be interested. Were there other key persuasion points that might be instructive?
Yeah, this will not surprise you that I'm coming to this conversation at policy, but there were 2 key policies that really mattered to make those investments, and they were tax credits. We needed the tax credits both on solar and wind. And at that time, and still I think it may be true, I don't know right now, but it was only 2-year credits, and then they would roll it over. So you had to make an assumption that it would come back for another 2 years, it would come back. So we spent a lot of lobbying time, Goldman Sachs did, to ensure that those tax credits stayed in place. Because the economics just at that time did not compare. And Goldman Sachs, to me, let me be clear, at the time, also owned 24 coal-fired power plants. So we could compare the numbers as to what the cost of coal-fired power was with wind, and it was not a cost-effective investment at the time. And having those tax credits in place made it an effective investment, even for the long term. The second piece that mattered a lot in that is we sort of had, Goldman Sachs had been influencing the governor of New York as well as the governor of New Jersey to create a regional climate exchange. And that regional climate exchange sort of limited the amount of carbon pollution coming out of coal-fired power plants. So there were a series of these regional pieces, but being a part of that sort of made it easier to do. But the policy piece was not a small piece, it's sort of an understated piece that no company will ever talk about, but I will tell you that it made the economics of those things work. And it sort of created an incentive to do that because, it provided favor with the governors and it provided favor with other people. So it was sort of a trade-off that you had to make.
Gotcha.
I'll leave that. And then the last place where I did investments was at google.org. So I joined Google very early on when they were first setting up the philanthropy. The reason I joined Google was for 2 reasons. Sheryl Sandberg had been a friend at the time at Treasury and sort of would call me every day for about 6 months asking me to come over and why I hadn't made that decision. But the second, and actually the more important reason for me, was that they were not looking at just philanthropy. They were looking at how you could use grant dollars with investment dollars simultaneously to make investments. I wasn't interested in giving away money. I was more interested in how do we invest in organizations and companies, especially in India and Africa, East Africa, which is where we were focused. And really thinking about how do we look at the bottom of the pyramid, not as a giveaway, but much more as like, there's a lot of business happening there, but there are factors that are creating problems with those businesses, and we should think about what those are. So we had grant dollars where we were doing some research and trying to understand what was happening, but we created several funds to invest in India in impact investing. What is now called impact investing, what we then called investing in small and medium-sized enterprises. Similar to the United States, 2/3 of all jobs in in most countries are built on small and medium-sized enterprises. These are companies that, you know, have 5 to 10 to 25 employees and very little capital going to them from large banking institutions. So trying to understand what we could do to invest in those areas. One big challenge that we faced there is the larger the fund became, the harder we were having a time to go small. And so it's counterintuitive, but it's too expensive to invest in small businesses when the fund is at 200 million or 300 million or 400 million. You have to expend the money faster. And you wanted to write big checks as opposed to small checks. So we, understanding that, the first fund we created, we limited to $20 million because we saw the big funds in India and East Africa that were at 100 and 200 and 300. They were only willing to write check sizes, investments of $1 to $5 million, not $50,000 to $100,000, which is where we wanted to be, because we knew that if we understood what was happening with that data and where businesses were going, we would learn a lot more than if we were just in the, $1 to $10 million range. That just wasn't the place where we wanted to be at the time. But that was a big learning. I mean, that was a year's worth of fights of people wanting to go big on the fund, and us recognizing that the bigger we were, the harder it was going to be for us. The second big learning was the private equity model was really hard. You have a 7-year window, you're trying to make long-term investments, you're trying to learn what's going on in the marketplace at the time and trying to do work. I sort of walked away from that experience, and I still walk away from that experience with the idea that you don't always need private equity funds, that holding company structures or other types of structures where you can make long-term investments in companies are super important, and where you can use both debt capital and equity capital. You don't need just equity capital. A lot of the businesses, and especially emerging markets, but I think it's the same in the US, did not trust equity. Family-owned businesses did not trust equity. They did not trust equity players. They called them vulture capital instead of venture capital. They just didn't trust anything. So we had to reformulate the fund to have a fairly large debt component, and some small amount of equity component. But that was a very important learning, and I still think that holds even in the United States. I don't think it's, I think we should be building long-term value in companies and not short-term, how quickly can I get out of my investment in companies, especially in businesses that you're talking about, which have real impact on both the environment and community.
Yeah, I mean, this is a central problem in the natural products world, is that there's plenty of money if you're willing to flip your company and exit in 5 to 7. But, many of us have a much longer term mission here. I want to come back to that in the Q&A.
And Gary, we should come back to that in Q&A, because I think just given the amount of liquidity in the market, there may just be an opportunity for that now.
Right, we must talk about that.
Because I think that there's an opportunity. So the last piece I want to talk about, and Gary will not be surprised that I come to this, is the importance of not policy in terms of legislation, but policy in terms of what the role of government can be. I have worked in government twice in my life. I was in the Clinton department. I was at the Treasury Department in the Clinton administration, and Bill Clinton's administration. I was at the Treasury Department. That was from 1995 to 2002. And then I was in the Obama administration from 2009 to the end of 2011. And I think the thing that I've learned, and the thing that I will say in both places, is government is 3 parts. One is policymaking. So what are the rules? What are the regulations? What are the policies, the legislation? 2, the government's an investor. And I just don't want to underemphasize the importance of that. It is a very large investor. The Navy and the military itself is one of the single largest investors in the clean energy industry. And it's either number 1, 2, or 3, but I can't remember which ones. It falls in one of those places. It is a large, large investor. And the third thing that the government is it's a purchaser. Single largest purchaser of Chevy cars in the country is the US government. And what happens sometimes is people just think of government as a policy-making body, a rules and regulation body. And what we never look at, which is why I wanted to go back into government the second time, is we never look at the innovations and the way we might think about government differently from the inside, which is how do we invest differently? And I'll give you two examples, but I'll give you, there's others that came out of it. One, we created a thing called the Social Innovation Fund, and the government became investor in social enterprises across the country. But because and our fund wasn't big, it was $50 million, but because we put in $50 million, it brought in another $500 million because the government took the initial risk. Because we were willing to write off our amounts if we needed to. And that mattered a lot. Right. And that I think it's sort of, the government can be the initial risk taker. We sort of never want it to be, but frankly, it should be. That is the role of government. Right. The internet doesn't exist because, because the government didn't invest in it. Internet exists because the government actually made a fairly massive investment in it.
Well, NASA put photovoltaics within range.
Exactly. So we can go through lots of those inventions that have been, all of the NIH investments in medicines and in early stage medicines is I know we talk about pharmaceutical industries, but a lot of that work comes from government investments. So I just think it's important to think about like government as an investor, and frankly, the riskiest of the investors. The second, this happened in climate. We were large investors in clean energy across the board, and I think took a lot of the riskier loans in those portfolios. We got a lot of heat in it in the Obama administration, but we also did that. The second thing we started to do was think about how do we procure differently? How do we procure products differently? What questions do we ask in the procurement process? Just changing the question changes how many people apply.
Wow.
And so often we get caught up in how do I change the policy? How do I change this? Frankly, just changing the questions we ask and the preferences we give if we are looking to purchase changes the way and who gets access to procurement. And I think that's an important version. I would just keep in mind, like these are, and this is at city, state, and national. I'm talking about the federal government because I worked in the federal government, but city governments, state governments, national governments were all purchasing. How we purchase and what we purchase and what rules we put in place makes a huge, that's $1 trillion industry.
Well, I'm going to interject here because I know people are wondering, okay, that sounds pretty good. I don't have to deal with venture capital. I could get government for my business. I mean, rules of the road. How does a small, you mentioned the city investments, rules of the road for enterprises. How do you step up to the plate and become, I mean, of course there's requisitions, right? There's meal, but you're talking about actual investment.
Yeah. So, I can give you one example and there's more. So, remember when Revolution Foods wanted to get into the food market, the school food market? One of the biggest things that they had to do was convince school districts that they could purchase the food differently. And it would be healthier, cleaner. There was a better way to provide better food. And you're going against, frankly, some of the larger players like Aramark. Right. And when Houston, and it takes a bit of a consortium. So I'm not going to say this is an easy thing by any means, but in Houston, for example, it took foundations, it took the school district, and it took some legislators to work together to allow for purchasing in a few schools that then eventually became a school district purchase, which then became an HISD purchase, which is the largest school district in Houston. And then it went to Louisiana, and then it sort of opened up the market. But it really requires, again, not that different from the Goldman Sachs story, finding those entrepreneurial people who want to make something different happen. And that might be going to one county, it might be going to one district, it might be going to a superintendent, it might be trying to figure out who is that person that's going to make it happen, as opposed to trying to bang your head against a wall and convince someone that it's going to work because they should. I'm always about revolution and finding the revolutionary people internally.
Yeah, and what you're saying from a couple of rounds in government is there's those people are there. There's
a lot of them there, and they want to make it happen. It takes some work to find them, and I know as entrepreneurs it's super hard to do that, but if there's ways for groups of people to come together to say, how do we find those, or invest in an institution or organization that can help you find them, that would go a really long way, because it takes one purchase, it takes two purchases, and then people are like, well, if that city does it, why can't we do the same thing? Like just do the example today of PPEs. they're like, oh, if the state of California is doing that, New York's like, why don't we just do what they're doing? Or Massachusetts is like, why don't we do what they're doing? It is in government, it's a very replicatory process. It's very little about new ideas. It's very much about, if they can do it, we can also figure it out. And that's certainly what Revolution Foods as an example shows. It's just one example, but it sort of shows that example of how we can do that.
Yeah, indeed. Back to the, actually New York City schools food system has put a lot of businesses, a lot of organic and natural companies into the marketplace for sure.
Right. And it's sort of using that example. So I walk away, I want to end here, Gary, because I think we should go into Q&A. Yeah, but I think the bigger questions I would just say here are, one, entrepreneurship is entrepreneurship, but finding entrepreneurial people who also can help you get what you want to get done matters. It's not just about the big institutions and the senior players and the big names. It's about people who internally know how to make the system work to make it happen for you.
Yeah.
Two, think about policy differently or government differently. Do not think about government as just a policy maker, but think about government as as sort of a purchaser, as a player, as an investor. And then as you think about investors, think about who you want who you want to get money from. Not every investor is a good investor, and the bigger the fund, the more quickly they need to get out and get their numbers. The smaller funds are probably where you, at least still, from my perspective, is where you're going to find sort of nimbleness to figure it out.
Yeah, super helpful. I'm going to press you. We do have questions and I want to get to them. You did another entrepreneurial thing that you probably even take for granted, which is that you established this incredible office in the Obama administration. Denise asked a question, what's the status? I assume social innovation is not happening under this, but I mean, can you just tell briefly how that happened? How you made that? And that had to be exciting.
It was exciting. And also not without its challenges, to be fair, right? When we first came into the administration, we were in a financial crisis. Every single day we were worried about whether there was going to be a run on the banks. And so innovation wasn't exactly the thing everybody was thinking about, but it's also the biggest opportunity to be thinking about innovation, to be doing that. President set it up. We had made a recommendation to him on the transition team. I worked on the transition team. Didn't know if it was going to happen. Actually sent the memo up to him. And I got a call 2 weeks later after I had gone back after inauguration to California, saying, hey, we want to set up this office. Can you start next week? So I got in my car on a Wednesday and drove and got to DC by Sunday night, and started. But the biggest things I think I would say in setting up that office is, one, convincing people that innovation was okay, and that term government can be innovative, because it sort of had gotten to the point where everybody was like, oh, we have to do it this way. We have to do it this way. These are the rules of the game. This is how we think about the rules of the game, but sort of teaching people how to do that. So 3 big learnings I took away from the from doing that. One, finding, again, not dissimilar to the points I was making, finding those people internally that wanted to do it and sort of giving them the power and the cover to get it done. So I took the heat if something didn't work, but giving them the cover to keep trying and to keep testing and to keep doing stuff. 2, creating teams of people within an institution. So it required somebody from the legal team. It required somebody from, whatever the portfolio or company organizational piece. And it required somebody from the senior side to provide them cover. But if you had 3 or 4 people, like, they could get shit done. But the legal portion of that really mattered. If the lawyer said no, everything sort of came to a halt. So finding the lawyers that wanted to say yes was sort of one of the biggest things we did, was finding those lawyers that wanted to get to yes, that weren't just looking at no. And then the last piece, which is sort of what the Goldman Sachs example is highlighting and using the president and the first lady's time to highlight where those successes happened. So we had over 29 events with the president and first lady in the first year, because every time there was success, we found a way to create an event with them. And I want to, that is the biggest value in the White House, is the president and first lady's time. Yeah. So taking that moment to, like, being entrepreneurial about how to use that time wisely, And we didn't do it during big news cycles, right? I didn't care if it was on a Monday or a Friday. Like I was happy to take the Friday news cycle that nobody cared about and use it as a way to sort of create innovation within a community that otherwise wouldn't have thought about it. But we had to be smart about it. But using that time sort of gave us a lot of ability to move things because everybody wanted to be a part of the next event or the next thing or to be.
Can you just for folks who weren't, for whom this is a distant memory, let's say that nicely, what are 2 or 3 examples of events you brought them in on to just give a flavor for the office?
So towards the end of the administration, we did several large events on investing in climate and clean technologies, if you remember, and bringing investors to the table where government was also an investor. I think in those moments, that's when Bill Gates sort of stepped up and sort of put together his big fund. But in those moments, we were able to raise over $3 to $4 billion of commitments. Because the government was willing to step in and the president was just willing to do an event and show up for 10 minutes.
Yeah. It's as opposed to building golf clubs, country
right.
Clubs. Yeah. Cool. Well, listen, thank you. I mean, I tell you, the one thing, your entrepreneurs are what I call pathological optimists, and it's hopeful to me that you just keep reemphasizing again and again and again. Find entrepreneurial people who get it, people who want to get to yes. I mean, that's a real theme in your life. And I think it's a great reminder to us because so many of us are dealing with no's, and of course it's a frightening time. So Daniel here asks, what innovations or social innovations or initiatives are exciting you most today, right now?
Yeah, I and largely because I've just been in since I've left the campaign, been focused on like a couple of things. The things that I'm sort of really focusing on right now is fintech and really thinking about how do we get access to capital to low-income communities and what are some ways to do that in a way that is cheaper. I mean, it's ironic that in the United States, the rich get access to free banking services because the poor are willing to pay all of those stupid fees. And that we sort of get our free bank accounts, our free checking accounts and all of that stuff. But who's paying all of those fees? Everybody that doesn't have more than $400 in their bank account. And it's ironic that every other part of the world has been able to create an innovation approach to this. And we in the United States, as the most developed country, can't figure that out. So that's one of the places I've been spending a lot of time sort of trying to figure that piece out and what are sort of, banking methods to do that. The second area I've spent quite a bit of time in sort of the social entrepreneurship space, not surprisingly, sort of in the healthcare. How do we get access to health, but how do we sort of change people's mind about outcomes in health as opposed to just another healthcare company that, provides another service that costs an X amount of money, but how do we pay people to get to outcomes as opposed to just paying people for the services that they provide? So I've been spending quite a bit of time on that, but those are the 2 areas right now. And again, it's more of the moment than it is sort of, because that's what my personal interest was, but it's just because I spent the last, month thinking we're focusing on those 2 things.
Well, yeah, but of course, a lot of these, I often describe the natural and organic product space as being preventative healthcare, right?
Correct.
So,
Correct.
I mean, one of the questions in here, from Ava was how do smaller businesses play a role in these social enterprises or get started in supporting those that they believe in? And I think sometimes just reframing and rethinking your and recommunicating how you are positioning yourself right now. I mean, obviously, when we're paying, what we have in this country is a sickness care system, right?
Yeah.
Where and so just spend a moment, if you would. I'm sure it defies condensing, but how do we make an outcomes-based? Are you talking about modifying policies within existing healthcare institutions, or?
It's a great question. I mean, so one of those things that, not surprising, which is one of the things we thought a lot about on the campaign too, which is if you were to draw a Venn diagram of what healthcare looks like and how different pieces, whether it's food, whether it's access to health, whether it's preventive, things, if you were to draw that Venn diagram and where those things are, a person is here, and then we have to think about all the different pieces of it. we never think about the diet. We never think about this thing as a person. We sort of think about the healthcare system. We think about the food system. We think about, and what we thought a lot about was how do we create policies that sort of, how do we make a person healthy? And then what are the pieces, the agricultural pieces, the other pieces that need to sort of come together to make that happen? So in my view, to get to the healthcare place, and this is just a policy perspective more than anything else, is we also have to just stop thinking in boxes. We're so focused on our box that we're in. If you're in healthcare, you're more thinking about payments and how do I make the payments to Medicare or Medicaid or all those things. What we never ask, and I think we have to change our mindset of asking, is how do we make a person healthy? Is food the problem? Is education the problem? Is the service the problem? But we don't ever ask that question. We sort of assume that the service is the problem, and then we sort of think about everything else.
Yes.
And we come at it, we're like, well, we'll just give free and reduced lunch because that's what people need. And we come at food sort of back-ended as opposed to from the beginning. How do I help a child learn better? And what is it going to take to make that happen?
Yeah. Yeah. And the science is there now, you know, just like we know that we know we're warming the planet. I mean, not obviously everybody, there's a certain cohort in DC who's still in denial, and we also know it's profitable to reduce our impacts. We know preventative health care is cheaper. MD Anderson is proving it's lifestyles. It's not drugs. It's things that are hard to charge for. By the way, Jeff here, this is slightly related, but you know, we're going to get all kinds of questions. Jeff, do you have a perspective on fintech banking for the cannabis space? Any in of the many worlds you touch in?
I mean, I don't. And the thing that I care about, you know, we thought about this even in the cannabis stuff for the campaign, is you know, making sure that it's also, there's an equitable component to this, and making sure that there's access for financing for people of color. So people of color disproportionately get put in jail. People of color disproportionately do not get access to banking for cannabis.
Yes.
And so I think in this component, I would push us all to think about what's that, how do we think about equity as a part of who we are, and not just something we think about when it's a policy issue or other things, but like who's getting access and who's not getting access matters.
Yes, indeed. Indeed. And to your point, bigger unfortunately tends to command more of the sort of traditional financial interests. Sean is asking, back to your point about buying, view government not just as a source of policy, but as a source of investment and a customer. Federal government, and I recognize you weren't just talking about federal, because you were explicit, this is at the local, state, county, et cetera. Federal government procurement processes can be very complex. Are you aware of initiatives to streamline these processes or other incentives for smaller impact enterprises?
Yeah, the answer to that question is I would start at state and local and county, because I think the federal government's too complex right now. We were trying, when we were in the Obama administration, there was actually a whole group in there that was just trying to work on how to change the procurement process within federal government. And just because the significant amount, it goes back to sort of the investment side, the significant amount that the federal government has to purchase, it can't do small amounts. And so it created it creates disincentives for smaller companies, but this is where state and local can really help sort of invest in small companies that can eventually, you know, make it to the federal. But it requires, and I know there's a whole group of people, in fact, at the Beck Center at Georgetown, we're about to start a whole process on procurement change and how do we change procurement within the federal government. It will not surprise any of you that is probably the place where it's like a death knell to anybody, because all the lobbyists are working against you at the same time. But it's important, I think, at the city and state levels, there's a lot more flexibility to do that. So that's where I would start, city, state, county. I would not start at the federal level. You
know, it's fascinating, and this touches on a few of the questions that were asked here. You know, Stonyfield, to toot our own horn for a second, but to give an example that backs you up, we've been very active in converting playing fields and parks, as you know, around America to going organic. And this really began as a very grassroots initiative with a group of moms in Irvine, California. And they're now called NTN, non-toxic neighborhoods, excuse me. And they were proving that you take pesticides and herbicides out of these communities, obviously there's long-term benefits in terms of healthcare, but they were showing that cities and towns were actually saving money immediately. And now they've formed themselves as a nonprofit into catalyzing, and we've sort of piled on with them. And we went to our local professional baseball field in Manchester, New Hampshire. Baseball team converted their stadium last year. They couldn't believe it. The grass was greener. The maintenance costs were lower, the water holding capacity. And so the mayor heard about this, our local mayor in cash-strapped New Hampshire. And now she's adopting a local park and a group of creating some business with Stonyfield being one of the funding sources for local entrepreneurs to, who had organic practices. They knew how to do it, but nobody was asking for them. And it will help put them on the map, get them. So one of the answers I would have to the earlier question about how is sometimes, think of government as a partner in demoing, right? In exhibiting and modeling these practices, because then you get the sanctioning, like you used the president, not a bad, magnet, right? The president and first lady, but even at the local level, you get signage in parks, you get parks and rec people talking about it, you get references. People right now, it's just desperately critical for companies to build trust. Moms, folks at home are looking, and with tighter and tighter economy, as people are not getting paid and jobs are they're looking to make the decisions are not just about who can I trust to help my family's health, but who can I trust to deliver me real value. And I do believe you're right. I think government can be a very powerful kind of influencer or sanctioner of activities to help.
In Philly, when they needed to bring in new grocery stores because there weren't grocery stores in poor neighborhoods, it was the government that sort of provided the incentive for grocery stores to come in, smaller grocery stores to come in. Same in Detroit.
Chicago and Detroit too, yeah.
I think it's important to remember that large companies get large subsidies from local governments. There's only one reason that stadiums are effective and are cost effective. It's because the government gives a significant subsidy to the stadium builders. They pay no taxes for 15 to 20 years. They pay no taxes on the concessions that come in. So let's be clear that you are not playing on a level playing field. Yes. And this is the single greatest thing about social entrepreneurs or social impact payers that makes me crazy, is that we think we're playing on some level playing field that, we don't need subsidies. Let's not talk about subsidies. Let's not talk about subsidized capital. Let's not talk about any of those things. The reason they don't get subsidized capital is because the freaking government gives them subsidies. And the only reason that Whole Foods works or all of these organizations work, and let's just talk Amazon. We all saw it in public. The amount of subsidies that came in from the state, federal, and local government in Virginia means that Amazon effectively pays no taxes for 2 decades.
Yeah.
So that is not your problem. That is not a problem that, Healthy Foods or anybody else has to face. That is a problem that is where the playing field is not level. And so thinking about where your government, and be creative about what the government, it may not just be money, it may be giving you tax-free land. It may be allowing you to build somewhere that you get 5 to 10 years of no taxes and you can bring an investor in because they'll take that, right? But I would be much more creative than just about the check that gets written about what you can get from government. And it can be a convener, it can bring people together, it can, bring investors together. There's lots of things that a government can do, but get creative about it, because I don't think the government's a small player in this.
Yeah. Well, and you made the earlier point that there's power in coalitions and scale when it comes to these things. Also, it's hard for one single business. So you're getting to a big question that Sean has asked, which is perhaps more than we will have time for because it's an important one. So there's often confusion about what defines social enterprise, and perhaps more importantly, what impact metrics should be used. What are key metrics in measuring social impact across sectors?
Sean, great question. It's probably the debate that makes me the craziest.
Yes.
Because I feel like we spend way more time on the metrics piece than we do on the value piece. I sort of think metrics is sort of easy to say, let's follow the metrics when we don't want to answer all of the other questions, which is how do I run my company well? How do I make sure I'm using? So I am sort of different from where a lot of my colleagues are in the social impact space. I think you as an institution or an organization should create the metrics you believe are important for the business that you're doing. Measure yourselves against those values. Just make that data public, because once lots of companies make that data public, we'll get a sense of how to measure across sectors. The problem right now is we're trying to create metrics for data we don't actually have. And we're sort of superimposing onto smaller businesses what they should be doing about social impact, when social impact might just be you actually surviving and paying your bills. Yes. And paying your staff or taking care of your staff. So I think what I would urge all of you all to do is to think about what's the impact you want to have and what's the reason you're doing what you're doing. Are you having that impact and holding yourselves accountable to it? But making that information public so people know transparently what you're actually doing, and not get too caught up on whether it's impactful enough or not impactful enough, because I just think it's a dumb debate that we're sort of, it's the easy thing to fall into, and the harder thing to do is to create smarter businesses that are investing in long-term value.
Yeah, well said. Well, of course, COVID has sort of reduced us down to some real basics, right? I mean, healthcare workers on the front lines need nutrition. You got a nutritional product, donate it. I've watched Orgain and other companies who've been, Orgain has given out 100,000 of these organic shakes to workers, and I mean health workers, and you can nominate someone. And of course, the healthcare workers are only happy to hold up signs, take their photo, and thank, and so on. So it you know it when you see it, right? Real need. There, we go to the micro. I can't pronounce Onakepe's name. I think is. Are you familiar with how food companies can tap into SBIR grants? Is that?
Yeah, it's a good question. Gary, I think one of the people that you may want to think about talking to at some point is Michael Chodos. He used to run a lot of the SBA programs and knows the SBI process very well. Okay. Also, most recently was the general counsel for a new company called doing e-notarizing, so notarizing online, and just really knows that process better. What I don't want to do is give a half answer to that, because it's an important question. Yeah. But I'm happy to put Onakepe in touch with a couple of people that know that better than I do. Okay, there's a follow-up right there. Let's see, we have one person nominating you to be a vice president under Biden here. Or with Biden, I should say. Well, actually, that's an interesting question. Because we are approaching the end of the time. I'm curious, how are you thinking about service? I mean, obviously, you and I are working hard for Pete to be our next chief executive, but I would assume or hope if we're, and I'm not taking this for granted, that we get a change in government, that Pete would have a role. Do you think about entering the federal government again? You know, I personally think I've worked in two administrations. I've worked in the Clinton administration and the Obama administration. I always think that there is an opportunity and a need for more people who are entrepreneurial to come into government. The only thing I want to do is to be on the personnel process for the next transition team, so we can hire those people to bring them in. Yes. Singly, I think the most important thing we could be doing is bringing in new ideas, new thinking, new people into government. And that is how we're going to shift the way the government operates. And frankly, there's no better time to be thinking about that than now, given how decimated the current government is. Yes. But I also think, and I certainly hope for all of you that are listening, and if you have friends or family and others, do not dismiss working in government if at some point in your career, at some point in your life, but being a part of that process, because the skills that you bring, while you might think government is not for you, you'd be surprised what you bring to the table. The way you think, the way you approach a problem, the way you solve problems, the way you think about bringing people together. All of this stuff is so natural to you that I think many of you take it for granted. And please, at the state level, at the national level, at the city level, right? Some of the best, Pete did extraordinarily well because at the city level, he was able to bring new players to the table that nobody had ever thought about.
Yes.
What the governor of California is currently doing and bringing people together to think about, how to reopen the economy and what they're doing. They're surviving in New York. They're surviving because they're thinking about it differently. So I hope that many of you will, at some point in your careers, whether it's, 10 years from now, 5 years from now, 15 years from now, really think about coming into government as entrepreneurs, because you could really change the shape of the way this country goes by just being a part of that.
Well, that is a perfect way to get to the last question I wanted to ask you. Yesterday, we were on with several large groups of natural products retailers and a big wholesaler who were saying that a lot of the large companies are having a hard time keeping up, which means that there's opportunity now. Watch the shelves, see what isn't selling, and plug yourself in there. And little brands who might not have gotten a look before, especially if they can produce toilet paper, right now, can get in. You shared some remarkable statistics on the road as you and I travel around for Pete about what has actually happened in the agencies, opportunities for young people. Obviously, we hope we're working hard for a change in government here. Do you mind just recapping a couple of those? Because I think people, it's a hopeful note in the sense that there's definitely going to be opportunities for optimistic folks to plug in here should we be fortunate enough to change this administration.
Yeah, Gary, those are like, in some ways I want to start with, it's going to be disheartening when I give you these numbers, but I want to also keep in mind where the opportunity here is. The disheartening part of this is that 50% of the State Department working staff have left. They have retired, they have left, they do not want to be a part of the government because they feel like they have stuck it out and it's been really hard. 30% of HHS has left, hence the problems that you're currently seeing in COVID-19. 25% of EPA has left. And these are civil servants. This is not, federal, appointees. These are civil servants that are leaving because they feel like it's too difficult to stay in and government has become harder. And they stayed through the Bush administration. They stayed through the Reagan administration. There are many people that have been in government for a long time who know the way around the system. So it to me was like why Pete worked was when you think about the types of people you need to bring into government to change, to fundamentally transform government. I'm not talking about changing it around the edges at this point. I am like fundamental shift.
Yes, clearly.
We need people with energy. We need to think about how we hire people in government. We need to think about how we bring in people in government. Maybe it's for 3-year terms, maybe it's 6-year terms, maybe it's a 10-year term, but we can do it differently. We don't have to go the whole hog process that we've been doing, but we need new energy in government, and we have to attract a generation that is fundamentally going to change the shape of this country. And we don't have a choice, frankly.
Yes, which is another way of thinking differently about government, is be part of it. I'm a pathological optimist, as you are, and as a lot of people are on this call. And the reason I wanted to end there is because, first of all, you're right, it's tragic. On the other hand, that's what's at stake in this election, right? So obviously, I can't have any kind of public forum without reminding people, let's not forget it's election year. We're not having rallies out there, but it could not be a more critical time. Sonal,
can I just on that point just say, look, the best thing you can do is call 15 people and ask them to make sure they're going to vote this year. Like if you ask 15 and they ask 15 of their friends, we sort of start creating a relational database that starts to do this. But there is no more critical time to be voting than this year.
Here, and then serving.
Yeah.
Listen, as usual, we covered a lot of ground. You are a continued font of wisdom and hope. A couple of themes I heard. I love the social enterprise. Are you building an enterprise, or are you trying to make a difference? I think quite a few companies could ask themselves that too. I've often thought the lasting impact of Stonyfield will be the thousands of family farmers who have proven to themselves that organic works, whatever happens to the brand. I love that. Finding people in the institution, at Goldman Sachs, in government, in banking, who really have the heart, who care. You've touched a lot of places that for a lot of us is like the third rail, government, ooh, banking, ooh, who wants to be there? Wall Street. but you're telling us people with high, those are bankers are people too, right? Bureaucrats are people too. And there are people who really are there to make a difference and look for them. The importance of policy with all the things we're marketing and selling and trying to grow. Don't forget that role. It's not, a lot of us aren't comfortable or we don't spend a lot of time in the policy arena, but it's such a great reminder. You said big is not always better. The bigger the fund and the bigger the partner, the tougher it can be because they've got to put more to work and they're not necessarily going to be as entrepreneurial. I think that's really like basic but important. Think differently about partners, build coalitions here to go before government to change policy, to go before government for purchasing. Think about 5, 6, 7 other natural or organic companies who you might be able to market and communicate with so that the power, your power is greater. We do this with Organic Voices, by the way, this nonprofit that I chair. 150 of us are now singing from the same choir book, which is that organic means 700 chemicals are prohibited. That's what it means. You don't have to get into literally talking about which chemicals. You just 700. Who wants to? Who doesn't want that? Taylor. Thinking about government as an investor and purchaser and partner. I think that's just so helpful and important. So, again, thank you for the inspiration. I knew you would do this. Carlene, if you could quickly flash up the slide on the, before we wrap up here, on the webinars. We do have, as I mentioned, Sonal is obviously closing out April. We will have the Institute next week, but and it really fits, Sonal, with what you've been talking about. When you look at the mix of folks here, of course, we have 2 fabulous women entrepreneurs, Jane Miller of Lily Sweets and Marcy Zaroff, who's done so much pioneering in the eco-fashion world, speaking. Very hopeful, gritty, powerful women. I just really look forward to that. Wayne Wu is one of the lead VCs who I would say is most definitely not a vulture capitalist. Wayne is a deeply wise and a very, very experienced guy who really gets on the side of the entrepreneur and has a lot of insights about where the marketplace is going. So you got to join that. Elliot Bagoon similarly works every day with dozens of entrepreneurs helping on cash flow, financing, and marketing and sales, and he's going to offer a whole series of sort of do's and don'ts. And then, of course, talk about an industry in transition and a true social entrepreneur. My friend Danny Meyer will, on May 14th, talk about an earthquake. He had to let 2,000 people go, and some of you have watched what's going on with Shake Shack with the accepting of federal money and so on. And Danny is an immensely honest, and if you saw his interview on 60 Minutes, this is a guy who's feeling what's going on out there. And I think just the whole reinvention of hospitality will be fascinating. So I look forward to having you on those. And then lastly, quickly, we'll go to the slide on the Institute, which is, again, as Sonal mentioned at the beginning, next week. It's only $50. This is also a social enterprise. It's a nonprofit who puts this on. And again, I won't go through the programming, but if you want to see cases who are looking at how to finance, how to think differently about partnering, like Sonal's been encouraging, you don't necessarily just have to go after VC or equity, as Sonal was saying. We'll have some lunch speakers offering insights about the space. We'll have some positioning your brand or cause, as the case may be, in the afternoon. Some discussions with Walter Robb and others on Friday about leadership with the heart and retail channels out there. And then 14 companies who are trying to raise capital. You get to see them. You literally have a front row seat to watch 14 companies with over 40 investors, ranging from little angels to big funds, which is just a fabulous way to train yourself for raising capital. So please join us. We still have plenty of room as an online. We can take all comers. So again, back to you, Sonal. Thank you so much for not just joining us today, but really for your continued hope and for touching and inspiring so many. And I can't wait to see what you're going to be doing next. And I hope to be doing it alongside you, but I'm really honored that you joined us. So thank you.
Thank you, Gary. This was fantastic. And thanks for all the questions to everybody.
Yeah, you bet. All right, folks, stay safe. We will see you at the Institute and then the following week. Take care. Bye, Sonal.
Bye.